First, it's a great honor to be here, and I have to say I was surprised to learn that there was even such a thing as a Baratynsky Day. Um, when became interested in this poet back in the 1980s, he was outside of Russians. He was almost unknown, and even within Russia, he wasn't. He was known. It was a name that people would recognize, but didn't think much of ordinarily. Um, if anyone knew anything about Baratynsky, they knew his poem "Disillusion," or is one way to translate the name Razuverenia, because it had become a very famous art song that people um, were familiar with. And but outside of that, he was not well known. He anthologized a little bit, but he was known as one of the poets from the Pushkin era, uh, which is also known as the golden age of Russian poetry. And I have to say, one of the things that motivated me to study Baratynsky was even the very term, the golden age, because I thought, well, if we're the golden age of Russian poetry, why is there really only one poet from that period that we know of, Pushkin? And so I became interested in some of the lesser known poets uh, who were associated with Pushkin. And very soon I came across um, a lot of references to Baratynsky in Pushkin's own work, most famously in Eugene Onegin, where he um, has, so to speak, this letter that Tatiana writes to Eugene Onegin, presumably writing it in French, and he's basically wonders, wouldn't it be great if Baratynsky was here to translate this letter and into his beautiful Russian verse? Um, and I also very early, when I was still in college, came across a poem by Pushkin, which he wrote to Baratynsky, where he compares him to Ovid. And and then in my studies of Pushkin, I came across a comment from Nabokov in his commentary to Onegin, where he says that there's a special tonality that Pushkin uses with Baratynsky that he doesn't use with any other poet. So I became interested in this poet who was so fascinating to Pushkin. Um, and once I started exploring him, and as a graduate student at the University of Toronto, I began to understand why he was so fascinating. He does something very different from the rest of the poets of his day. I mean, he begins very much in sync with the mood of the times in the early 1820s, writing elegies, writing poems where he talks about not being able to love, where he talks about uh, the pain of life. But then he moves on to a very different register of verse, a different kind of language, even becomes more complex, um, more difficult. He starts introducing archaic words. He starts introducing very convoluted syntax, which is actually the very opposite of what we tend to associate with Pushkin and with the poetry of the Pushkin period. So he very much tries to stand apart. And that fascinated me, the sense of that Baratynsky had of wanting to be an authentic poet who had his own voice, who was doing something that was different from what other people were doing. Um, so I started studying him. I read a lot of criticism about him written by Russians and Soviet critics. And one of the things I noticed was one of the common topics was talking about Baratynsky's claim to greatness, or in fact, his non-claim to greatness. It was always Baratynsky could have been a great poet or was almost a great poet. There was a sense of underrating him. Even the people who were writing very admirably or in great admiration of Baratynsky somehow kept from putting him in the first ranks Russian poetry. And that was pretty much the case until the 1970s, where you began in Soviet criticism to get some excellent critical thought about Baratynsky from people like Lydia Ginsburg and Ilya Almy and others, who did very profound analysis of his verse and of his life, and not so much of his life, but of his verse, and brought out some of his great idiosyncrasies. And um, so that's sort of to say, that's how I got into it, was by this question of what made him a great poet, even though he wasn't being given that due. But today he has a day devoted to him, which is fantastic. And I'm so honored to be part of it. So I began translating Baratynsky when I was a graduate student, partly because, well, mainly because I was writing a dissertation on Baratynsky, and I wanted to get a strong sense of his poetry. And really the best way, I think, for me at least, to understand a poem is to translate it, is to actually struggle with some of the things that perhaps the poet himself struggles with in producing this verse. And so I began translating Baratynsky back in the late 1980s. I never finished my dissertation. I basically abandoned the academic world for a long time, and but I kept translating Baratynsky. So it wasn't until I was actually had left America, was living in Slovenia, where I live now, and I think it was because I wanted to get back to Russian. I was learning Slovene and felt a bit distant from Russian, that I began again translating Baratynsky in earnest. And it was around the same time that I met and became friends with a great poet, great Slovene poet, Tomáš Šalamun, who, when he learned that I was translating Baratynsky, was thrilled. He was one of the few people that I met outside the world of academia and Russian literature who knew about Baratynsky. The other, by the way, is another friend of mine here in Slovenia named Miklaus Komel, who's also a fine poet, great poet. And he too was thrilled when he heard that I was interested in Baratynsky. So that gave me some impetus. And it was Tomáš who actually connected me with, first with Matvey at Ugly Duckling Press. And then through Matvey, I met the indispensable to me editor Ilya Bernstein, who it will be reading, I think, right after me. And together we embarked on this book of translating Baratynsky's poems. And at one point, Ilya suggested, well, why not do his letters as well? And I said, okay. First I said, would you like to do them? Would you like to translate them? And he said, no. So I went into the letters, and that was really also the first time that I explored in depth his letters, which opened up another side of his life to me. So that's how this book, which some of you may know about, and which is the cover is being used for today's presentation. That's how that happened, through working with Ilya, who was simply the best editor I've ever had. So that's how the book came about. Let's see. I won't say too much more, except that today I thought I would start by making a few comments about one of what I think a key concept in Baratynsky, though it's not often talked about. And this is the notion of connection, of connecting with other people in life and connecting with his reader, famously in his poem, Moj dar ubok, my gift is meager and my voice not loud. That's what he talks about. And I found that to be really the key to understanding his work. for me, his lyric work, this need for connection. One of the things I noticed when I was reading him as a graduate student was the way he would often talk about the need for response, for odzif is the way he pronounces that word in his poems. Usually it's pronounced in standard Russian, odzif, but in Baratynsky's verse, it's always odzif, which seems to give it a bit of an elevated tone, and that means response. And he's always looking for response, whether it's from trees or whether it's from a readership. And he laments about not having readers in the society. One of the repeated motifs in Soviet criticism of Baratynsky at the time was he talked about the failure of the poet to connect with society and that discrepancy between the poet and society. And this is also one of the reasons why Soviet thought on Baratynsky tended to not rank him high, because he wasn't a poet of inspiring the society. And many of his critics at the time, notably Belinsky, really condemned Baratynsky for not writing verse that inspired people. And he talks about that failure in his poems, of the inability to reach people. And I found that fascinating. And today, in this time when we all feel unconnected, I thought that would be maybe a place to start, was where did Baratynsky find connection? And in fact, we can start with a poem for lockdown. I won't read the whole thing, but it was really, when I read it, I can remember very much when I first read it and felt like I understood it and almost wept, because it is such an expression of isolation and depression. And this is the poem "Na что вы dni," what use are you days? And it opens like this: what use are you days? This earthly existence will never change its forms. They all are known, and only repetitions the future promises. And I don't know, maybe many of us this past year have felt like that. You know, one day is just like another, we lose track of time. And the poem then goes on to talk about the discrepancy that the body and the soul themselves have. And so he addresses the soul, saying, the tight compass of sublunary impressions is long ago complete for you, who slumber now beneath recurring dream images. But it, the body, senselessly watches as the morning rises, replacing night in vain, as barren evening sinks into night's darkness, crowning the empty day. If there was ever a poem that you just wanted to go and hide under your covers after reading, that is a poem for you. But that's certainly one side of Baratynsky. And he talks in his letters about feeling depressed and disconnected from the life of Moscow. But the other side is where he does find connection. And one of the things that struck me most was that he finds this connection in poetry itself. He finds it famously again in the poem, "My gift is meager, and my voice not loud." He finds the connection with his reader in the future, his reader in posterity, through his poetry, that will be this link to the future, to the person reading him generations after the poem was written. But there's also very much something where he finds a connection in the language of the poetry, in the verse of the poetry, in the rhyme of the poetry. And I found that fascinating, because I felt that was a very modern insight into what poetry does for us. It somehow makes us feel connected and whole just in the verse itself, just in the language itself. And so he ends his brilliant book of poetry called Sumerki, which I translate as dusk. Other people translate it, a very fine translator, Peter Frank, translates it as half-light, or often it's rendered as twilight. But I like dusk as the translation because sumerki to me is a word that is focuses on darkness in a way. It's not total darkness, but not light. But at the end of this book, he has this vision of connection. And I'd like to read this poem, which is called Rhyme. And this is where I'll stop after reading it. Rhyme. When at the Olympian competitions or in the public squares of the young Greek city-states, he sang the Muses' ward, sang in the midst of waves of people hungering for musical elation. There lived within him then full faith in sympathy, with meter broad and unconstrained like grain swaying beneath the wind, unhindered flowed his harmony. The multitude stood riveted in their attention, till all at once a great convulsion swept over them and they applauded without end, and on the singer's sounding strings bestowed again new inspiration. When the orator mounted the podium in ancient Greece, when he ascended the tribunal in ancient Rome and would extol the nation's fortune or lament it, and the eyes of every person there were turned his way, and the rhetorician had full sway through the power of his speech over the people's will, he knew just who he was. He could discern how mighty was the God who governed his majestic word. But no agora for our thought is there, and for our thought, no forum. The poet in our age knows not whether he truly sails the heights or how great is his creative notion. Yourself, both judge and under judgment, explain your fevered restlessness. A gift sublime, an absurd disease, resolve this unresolvable question. Amid the lifeless sleep that is the world, amid its tomb-like coldness, it's you alone, O rhyme, who gladden the poet's heart with your caress. Like the dove of the ark, it's you alone who come back from the native shore, bearing a living branch for him. It's you alone in your response who reconcile him to the surge divine and recognize his dreams.